Sophie would be somebody that Catherine, when she becomes queen, could lean on increasingly in terms of another woman within the royal family for support. The one thing I've come to know about Sophie is that she is cool, calm, dependable, but also very warm, very emotional, very tactile. You know, when she goes on an engagement, she really does throw heart and soul into it. No one who comes up for a hug won't leave without having got one, but equally she's quite happy just to sit back and listen to the stories that people feel really compelled to tell her. Well, quite interestingly, friends say to me she was actually a lot more nervous and probably slightly less confident when she first joined the royal family. One friend, Lord Mountbatten, tells me that he joined her in the early days of her relationship with Edward on a cruise in Scotland with the Queen, and you know how nervous she was about putting a foot wrong, which I think is quite understandable in the circumstances. But he says to me that he's definitely seen her grow into this role over the years, and that she's always had that natural warmth and empathy and able to communicate with people, but she's slowly found her feet and the confidence to bring that out on a public stage. At the time she started dating Prince Edward, Sophie was working in PR, and not long afterwards she started her own PR business. So obviously she would have had a certain confidence in dealing with clients, but as friends say to me, nothing really quite prepares you for joining the royal family and the kind of international stratosphere into which you are propelled, whether you like it or not. And one of her good friends, Mary Montague Scott, tells me that Sophie has always been a strong person, a smart person, but you know, that life isn't for everyone, and that, you know, I don't think anyone would have blamed her if she'd said, do you know what, Edward, I love you, but that's not for me. But what Mary told me was that, you know, she and Edward are like peas in a pod. They really love each other. She wanted to be with this man, and that she was strong enough in her person to kind of take that leap forward and to embark on this really remarkable and unique public life with him. I think there's a reason why Queen Elizabeth saw her daughter-in-law Sophie as such a safe pair of hands. She really understands the way the royal family works, the pecking order that can sometimes exist in it, and really as an outsider, as a commoner, even though I personally hate the word, but she was, and what it's like for someone like that to marry into this very unique world and start living life within a goldfish bowl. And I know certainly when it comes to Catherine, she has really been a shoulder to lean on, not just over the past year during her cancer treatment, but from her time when she first started embarking on her public role when she became engaged to Prince William. And I know William and Catherine have enormous admiration for Sophie in the way that she has conducted herself over the decades, but also managed to bring her two children, James and Louise, up to acknowledge and respect the unique positions they hold in national life, but also to give them a chance to live their lives away from the spotlight and to grow and develop as young people. And I think that attitude is something Sophie really hoped she would able to bring when Harry introduced Meghan to the family. I know that Sophie was one of those people who really reached out to her, but much to her surprise, her efforts were really largely rebuffed, and the Duchess of Sussex made clear to people that she didn't really need much help, and if she did, that she would ask her husband for it. And I know that that's something Sophie did persist with, even when things were taking quite nasty turns. She continued to reach out to Meghan, but she didn't really want to know. I think what this tells you about Sophie is she's got all the right attributes to be a member of the royal family, because, you know, as anyone that has to mix family with business, it can sometimes be quite tricky at times. You know, there are strong personalities and also strong egos involved, but she's very good at navigating that. And I think, funny enough, that's something we've seen her bring to her work on the international stage, when she has become more recently very much involved as a global ambassador for the victims of sexual violence in conflict. And we've seen her bring those diplomatic and negotiating skills to her work, as well as to what happens within the family. The funny thing about being a member of the royal family is that you don't have the chance or the opportunity to let these big landmark birthdays quietly slide by. You know, Sophie has no choice but for people to publicly mark her 60th birthday. And I thought actually this would be a really good opportunity to do a very in-depth profile of her. I spoke to Buckingham Palace. I've been invited to accompany her on engagements, to see her work at first hand. I've also spoken to many of the organisations that she's had dealings with over the last couple of decades as a working member of the royal family, and also some of her closest friends. And I think what's very interesting about this, and tells us a lot about Sophie as a person, is that when it comes to speaking to people in royal circles, they're very reluctant for a number of reasons to go on the record about this, simply because there can be so much backlash against them personally. But these people are so proud of Sophie as a friend, they're so proud of what she's achieved professionally, that all of them spoke to me on the record and were happy to be named, because they said Sophie is someone who will never sing her praises personally. So they were actually quite glad to be be given the opportunity to do that for her. Sophie is someone who has huge resilience about her. I mean, don't forget when her and Edward started dating, and there was a 6-year courtship before they actually got married in June 1999. And that was actually very deliberate on their behalf, and also on behalf of the late Queen, in letting them do that, because of course we forget, but at the time the marriages of her 3 other children had imploded with varying degrees of public fallout. And so personally as well as professionally, I think she was really desperate for her younger son to embark on marriage with the best possible chance of it succeeding. I mean, friends say to me that in Sophie he really couldn't have picked anyone better. I mean, the late Queen Elizabeth and Sophie were incredibly close. Sophie very sadly lost her own mother, Mary, to stomach cancer in her 70s, and the Queen became really the mother that she'd lost. She used to call her Mama, and I think the Queen was able to spend more time with Sophie as well as Edward and their children in a way that she hadn't had the luxury of doing so when her older children, Prince Charles and Princess Anne, and to a lesser extent Prince Andrew, were growing up, where she was a young monarch doing these trips for months at a time around the globe. But with Sophie and her family, she had the chance to almost recapture that and do that again. And I remember one very senior royal aide telling me how the Queen used to pop along to Bagshot Park, Sophie and Edward's home in Surrey, and sit down and watch Mr. Tumble with James and Louise when they were children, which is a very famous children's programme in this country. It's something she would have never have had the chance to do with Charles and Anne, but she was able to do with the Edinburgh's children. I certainly think the Queen was a good role model for Sophie. She really did learn from the best. And also the Duke of Edinburgh, to whom she was extremely close as well. I mean, I think a sign of how special their relationship was, we could see when the Duke of Edinburgh sadly died, and the one photograph, the personal photograph that Buckingham Palace and the Queen personally chose to release was one that Sophie herself had personally taken of them at a picnic at Balmoral, where she captured how happy and smiling and relaxed they look. And I think that's just a sign of how special their relationship was. I think because they're so low-key, people don't often get the chance to see Sophie and Edward interact together, and that's been a real pleasure over the last year to see firsthand, because not only have I spent time with Sophie, but at the start of last year I also did a very similar profile of Prince Edward and actually got to speak to him personally to mark his 60th birthday. And I think what was so sweet about him is how proud he is of her. And you don't always see that with the royal family. Historically, we all know about the kind of tensions between Prince Charles and Princess Diana, where they were married. It's something that has been spoken about often. And I can certainly say I have not seen any professional or personal jealousy from Edward. In fact, I would say the opposite. He's incredibly proud of how well she has integrated herself into the royal family, and he's incredibly proud of how she conducts herself on the world stage. And when I chatted to him last year, I asked him about his wife. One of the questions I asked him was how important his marriage has been in terms of his life as a working royal, because I do think it can be a very lonely existence without the right partner by your side. And it was funny because Edward slightly struggled to find the right words, because he had so much he wanted to say and he didn't want to come across as being trite. But he basically said, look, she completes me. She has been the most brilliant wife and partner I could have ever asked for. I'm so completely proud of her. And I know she feels the same about him. When she gave a speech to mark his 60th birthday publicly, she said, like, I am also so proud of him. And there was a moment I thought was really notable. She said, and I still fancy him in a uniform. And you can see, I think, in action, what friends have told me is they really are peas in a pod. They are great together. They have similar interests. They love the countryside. They love walking. They've got 3 dogs they adore, but they can also go off and do their own things. And Sophie's very arty, very into music, very into public affairs. Friends tell me that there's nothing really she doesn't know about what's going on politically, socially, economically, on a global level. So they really complement each other. I cover a lot of engagements with members of the royal family, sometimes less so with the Duchess of Edinburgh, because she personally prefers to just let her work speak for itself, and she operates quite under the radar. But what's been really fantastic to see is how brilliant one-on-one she is with people, and how much she invests in the charities that she works with. A lot of them told me that we don't even see a fraction of what she does. Behind the scenes, she volunteers for them, particularly in times of crisis like COVID. She goes into bat for their clients. One charity told me how she saw a young man who had severe disabilities and wasn't getting the kind of care he needed within the system, and she said, right, I am not having this. What are you going to do for this young man? And lo and behold, he started getting the care and the help he needed. Others have told me that she spends hours writing letters on their behalf. She holds meetings around table, helps them brainstorm things strategically about their charities and the work they do at Bagshot Park, which has actually been turned, although it's a personal home, has been turned into a bit of a kind of home working hub for them that she regularly invites people into. And what I've also had the chance to see is signs of this great sense of humour I hear that she has. You know, she takes her work very seriously, but she doesn't take herself too seriously. And one lady who runs a charity for people with disabilities told me that to mark her birthday, they got all their clients to write down a word that they thought reminded them of Sophie, and they put them in a box, in a little treasure chest to give to her as a kind of very personal thank you. But the lady said that she'd made sure she'd taken some of the slightly, risque suggestions out, and Sophie straight away said, well, what are they then? She said, well, the odd comment complimenting you on your bottom or something like that. And Sophie said, put them back in. I need to see these. And apparently she keeps that box in the cloakroom at Bagshot Park. And she said, every now and again when I'm feeling down, I look at it and remind myself maybe I'm not so bad after all. Another charity told me how she is a great mimic, and she's quite musical and quite arty. So as a joke, they once gave her a kazoo, one of these kind of children's whistles that you can play on, and she gave them a pitch-perfect rendition of Sweet Caroline at an official engagement, which is something they didn't expect. Well, Sophie is one of the hardest working royals. I think last year she conducted well over 250 engagements. And sometimes those league tables don't actually give you a fair reflection of what goes into those engagements. And I've accompanied her on a number recently, and you can see the time she takes to speak to people, to get to know the charities she works with. And certainly internationally, she has really picked up the slack in recent years. A natural slack, of course, because we're seeing a lot more older members of the royal family. We've seen a naturally slimmed down monarchy that's lost Andrew and Harry and Meghan, the latter of which, whom particularly the Queen had high hopes for in terms of developing a relationship, particularly with the Commonwealth. And actually that's where Sophie and Edward have stepped in when Sophie insisted on going to Ukraine last year, and that was actually with some government reluctance to the trip, but she really put her head down and said, no, I want to go. She took along a letter with the King for her, which I think again shows a sign of the trust the King places in her. But it's not just those official duties she does. There's a lot of initiatives that she's developed off her own back. She's travelled around the globe, particularly in Africa, in terms of her work with preventable blindness, but particularly in recent years over her initiative to publicise what's going on around global trouble spots in terms of the use of rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war during conflict. Now, this is something she is hugely passionate about. She has gone to war zones from Chad last year to Sudan, Iraq. And just before Christmas, I was with her at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in London, where she stood up and she gave the most impassioned and articulate speech on the subject I think I've ever heard, for 7 minutes, without notes, off the top of her head, word perfect. She didn't skip a beat, and every single eye in the room was on her, and it was quite clear she knew her subject matter inside out. And that enabled her to speak from the heart. And at the end, some of the women that she was representing came up and just flung their arms around her and hugged her and kind of looked her in the eye and said, thank you for doing this for us. You understand more than anyone. Our suffering doesn't just end when war ends. You know, what happens rips families apart, it rips communities apart, and our pain is still ongoing, and you're still willing to champion us, so thank you. Well, like Queen Elizabeth, King Charles sees Sophie as a very, very safe pair of hands. Very much in the mould of Princess Anne, I would say. You know, one of the safest hands that the royal family has. They're willing to do a lot of the bread and butter engagements, as I would describe them, going to community centres, thanking volunteers, the things we expect as British and Commonwealth citizens, our royal family, to do, but might not be at the more glamorous end of the spectrum. And I certainly know William and Catherine have a particularly good relationship with Sophie. William has a lot of admiration for her personally as well as professionally. She's particularly close with Catherine. And I remember one of her very close friends saying to me some time ago that she believed Sophie would be somebody that Catherine, when she becomes Queen, could lean on increasingly in terms of another woman within the royal family for support. So I think what I hear from Royal Aid is that that role she has, particularly on the international stage, will only increase in the years to come and become more valuable to them. I hope you enjoyed that insight into the life and work of the Duchess of Edinburgh. You can read my full profile of Sophie at 60 on Mail Plus, and we will put a link to the article below.